In this video, we'll look at what is the capacity of a multi-layer neural network. Now, we have already seen that an single artificial neuron was limited in its capacity. There are certain classification problems that it cannot actually model if they're not linearly separable. However, we've looked at an approach where we would first learn a representation, so a transformation of our original space, in such a way that we could get a new representation where the data was then linearly separable. And then we've used that as a justification for having what we call the single hidden layer neural network, where we would first compute a representation, a hidden representation, so a transformation of our input space, hopefully in such a way that then the output of our neural network could then perform its job much more easily. So in the context of classification, so that it could actually perform the classification in the original space perfectly, distinguishing between the inputs in the class 0 and class 1. Now, can we actually show anything formal about that? So in other words, if we assume that we have a function f of x that takes this particular form, that computes a hidden layer pre-activation, applies an activation function, computes an output linear combination, so linearly combining the new representation, hidden representation of the input, and then applying some activation function at the output, to have a function that performs all of these transformations, what kind of functions can we actually model with this particular form, and are there functions that we cannot model? So let's look at this a little bit and try to get some intuition about around this problem. Now, here's a first example where we have a single layer neural network with two hidden units, which compute these two functions here. Okay. Now, you should be able to convince yourself that at the output layer, if we have an output neuron, then we can actually combine these two hidden units to get a new function with respect to our original input that would actually look something like this. We'd get a ridge that goes up here and then that goes down here. And essentially the way we can get this is by taking this neuron and subtracting from it this neuron. So by getting a linear combination of this neuron with this neuron, specifically essentially this neuron minus that neuron, we can actually get a ridge that is localized in a particular range of combinations of x1 and x2 values. So indeed, if we're here, then this neuron has a small value, but this neuron too. So we get a small value at the output. Now, if we're in this range, let's use another color. If we're in this range, then this neuron now has a large value, but this neuron also still has a low value. So because of that, we get a large value minus a low value. So we get at the output a fairly large value. And then if we reach this part here, then this is still large, but this is now, the second neuron has now become larger. So the value at the output will now drop because we're now subtracting a value that has become larger at the second hidden neuron. So we see, so this is, intuitively how we can get from these two simple neurons a more complicated output, which is localized in a particular range of x1 and x2 values. And now we can go into a context that's a bit more complicated, where we could get 4 neurons that would compute these 4 functions, and by combining them in a fairly similar fashion, we could actually get at the output a localized bump. So for values of these inputs, x1 and x2, within this part here, we could get an output which actually is large and low everywhere else here. Okay. And then we could actually continue making a more complex output by having 4 other neurons that would allow us to compute, say, another bump, maybe here, or maybe we could get a bump that's here with these with 4 other neurons. So we can see that by combining in 2 dimensions these 4 neurons together and having sets of 4 neurons for different parts of the input space, we could actually add a bunch of different bumps in different parts of the space and sort of carve out a more and more complicated function. So if we think of this, if we go in the setting of classification, this means that we could have chunks of regions that are actually separated, but that correspond to the same class. So say that R2 corresponds to class 1 and R1 class 0. Then by having several bumps here and bumps here and no bumps in the R1 region here and here, we can actually get a fairly complicated decision surface and a fairly complicated decision classification decision with a neural network that could have enough hidden units to place bumps at the right places to model our complicated decision function. Now, can we actually be formal about this? Well, it turns out we can. So we can show that a neural network with a single hidden layer is actually what is known as a universal approximator. More specifically, we can say that a single hidden layer neural network with a linear output can approximate any continuous function arbitrarily well, as long as it has enough hidden units. So this was shown by Hornick in 1991. So there are more details and technical details behind this theorem, so I encourage you to consult the original paper. But this is essentially saying that if you have a function which is continuous, so that does not vary too much, then we can actually model it as long as we give our neural network enough hidden units. So there are configurations of these hidden units and the output unit. There are values of their weights and biases such that we can model any function arbitrarily well. This result actually applies whether we're using sigmoid hidden units or tanh hidden units, and there are also many other hidden layer activation functions that makes this result true, that complies with this result. And so what this is saying is that by using neural networks, we are actually allowing ourselves to model many types of fairly arbitrarily complicated function. So this is a pretty good result. Now notice that it actually doesn't mean that there is a learning algorithm. So an algorithm that would find the behavior, the parameters of these, of all the units in the neural network that would actually allow us to model any function. So in other words, there might exist values of the connections, weights, and the biases for a neural network with enough hidden units that would allow us to model any function arbitrarily well, but it doesn't mean that we actually have the learning algorithm that will find the values of these connections and biases for any given function. And and in fact, there aren't really any known algorithm that can do this for any types of function. And we'll see that actually this is a whole field of research trying to develop more and more improved learning algorithms that can learn more and more types of functions, and more specifically that can solve more and more types of problems usually related to artificial intelligence.